Well, I first discovered the Beatles when I was 8 years old. It was February of 1974, and the TV show 60 Minutes was doing a segment on the 10th anniversary of the Beatles coming to America. When this special came on, and on came this segment about the Beatles, and I was riveted. I was just blown away. It was maybe a 10-minute segment. They held it to the end of the show, and I remember when it was over, I was so immediately obsessed with the Beatles. I jumped up and ran down the hallway to the bedroom, my bedroom that I share with my older brother. And I remember he had a whole, like a grapefruit crate of records. But I remember seeing this band, the Beatles, in this grapefruit crate, buried in amongst other records. I mean, we had, Miles Davis and Wes Montgomery and Dave Brubeck and all kinds of jazz and big band records. And I rifled through the records and I found the Beatles records. And there was the Beatles 65, and there was the Beatles' second album, and Meet the Beatles, and Abbey Road. And I just started playing these records over and over again. They were fascinating. Their music just struck a chord with me. Their look struck a chord with me. I'm only 8 years old. It's 1974, and I look back on it in retrospect and I think about the situation. Our family was a mess back then. My dad was deeply addicted to alcohol by this time. We were living in poverty. My parents were fighting constantly. I mean, we're not just talking screaming matches, we're talking them beating the hell out of each other, throwing furniture at each other, my mother getting beat up, all black and blue. And I think the Beatles were a sanctuary for me. I think their music provided a place for me to go and hide. And I would get lost in the Beatles music, and I would forget about everything that was going on all around me. I forgot all about the alcoholism and the fighting and the loneliness. I think the Beatles gave me sanctuary by giving me a place to go, by giving me a place to run and hide. I think the Beatles really gave me something that I couldn't find at home. By the time I was 8, my older brother got married and moved out of the house. He had actually went to college in 1968 and hadn't really come back. My sister got married in 1973, and she was living about 5 hours away with her husband, and they were both going to college at the time. So it was just me, my mom, my dad, and my brother closest to me in age living at home. And my brother closest in age at the time had gotten a job in a restaurant, and he had learned to drive, so he was never home. And so he was gone. I was home alone with my mom and dad most of the time. And I think the Beatles became like surrogate parents to me. They became surrogate parents. They became surrogate brother and sister. More surrogate brothers than a sister, because my sister, even though she was away, she tried to do her best in keeping in touch with me and mom, and to see if I was okay. And she would call all the time and write, and she would visit on the weekends sometimes from school with her husband. And she was the one person that actually seemed to care about me and mom. She really did her best. But the Beatles became like a surrogate to me. They became a surrogate brother, a surrogate father. And by the time I was 9, my brother closest to me in age had gone to college. So I was home alone with mom and dad. And I had nothing. I had some friends that I would hang out with, but the Beatles music it saved me. It lifted me up. It took me to a new place. It made me happy. It brought me happiness and love and joy. All those feelings that I didn't have at home. I don't know if I could have made it without the Beatles. The Beatles really, really got me through a lot. They took away the loneliness.
After discovering the music of the Beatles, I slipped into a fantasy world to escape what was going on at home. I'm not sure how else to describe it other than to say I was living in a dream world. It was like I was high on their music all the time. When I was in third grade, I drove my parents crazy, insisting that they take me to the mall to find Beatle boots. Keep in mind that the Beatles hadn't been a group in 5 years, and they hadn't sold Beatle boots in over 10. I lived in this Beatle-induced fantasy world until I was in my mid-30s. Positive side of all this, they inspired me to become a musician and write over 150 songs and record 5 CDs of original music.
Both of my parents grew up in an era where everybody drank. It was a cultural thing where, everybody had cocktail parties and would have a couple martinis after work and things like that. My mother's drinking was pretty severe, but it was mostly in the evenings and on the weekends. Mostly on the weekends from how I remember it. Mom always pulled it together, so she made sure I was up in the morning, had my breakfast, and I was off to school. Her drinking escalated when his drinking escalated. And I remember her saying something really weird. She said, well, if you can't beat them, join them. Which meant, she couldn't get him to stop drinking, so she may as well just join him. And she'd throw him back and get just as drunk as he was. My mom went into rehab in 73, and she said that was it. She was done with it. She was not going to do rehab again, and she was going to AA meetings with my dad, but I don't think she bought into what she referred to as their mumbo jumbo. By 1975, my mom got sober. She just decided that was enough. In spring of 1976, it was Mother's Day week. I came down with chickenpox. I was 10 years old. And one night, all I remember is I started projectile vomiting. And I was vomiting so much that this brown liquid was coming out of me. I was in a coma for about a week. And the next thing I know, I woke up in a hospital bed. And I looked around, and all I saw were like 10 or 15 people wearing white gowns and surgical masks and surgical caps, and I could only see their eyes. And I didn't recognize anyone except for my dad. I saw my dad, and I said, "Hi, Dad." Just like that. And I just remember everybody letting out this sigh of relief that I was alive. My chickenpox had progressed to something called Reyes Syndrome, which is a viral infection. And Reyes Syndrome causes the brain to swell. And as the brain swells, it has nowhere to go, and it begins to recede into the spinal column. The central nervous system begins to shut down all the vital functions of the body. The lungs and the heart and the kidneys and the liver and all that stuff start to shut down. 85% of the kids that got this died. And I, for some reason, survived it. But from that day forward, my mom promised me that she would give me a better life. She promised me that if Dad didn't sober up, she would divorce him, and she'd find a way to get us a house, buy a house of our own, and get me a dog. And she kept her word. And by 1977, near the end of 1977, my dad had gone into one of the best treatment centers in the country. It was in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania. And they told us that the recovery rate of most addicts that came out of this treatment center was like 80%. And so we had these great hopes that he would come out of there and he'd feel good and he'd be sober again. Well, Dad was gone for about, I don't know what it was. It was a long time. I think it might have been 3 months. And the day he came home, I'll never forget this. This van pulled in our driveway, and he got out of the van with his sponsor. His sponsor's name was Dick. And my dad got out where he always wore this long, like, trench coat that most men wore back then, like a tan button-down, full-length trench coat, raincoat type thing. And he looked brand new. He looked young. His eyes were clear. His skin was clear. He looked so good. I'd never seen him look that good before. And he walked in the house, and we hugged him, and we said hi, and I said, I love you. I'm so glad that you're back. Within a matter of an hour or so, after he got reacclimated in the house, he said, well, I'm going to go out and get some bread and some milk. And Mom and I looked at each other, we just looked at each other and said, okay. He left, he got in his car and he left. And he went down to the local convenience store. Came home. And he had been drinking. So my father had been out of rehab no more than an hour or two, and he was already drunk. And Mom, I don't remember how soon it happened, but Mom basically ended the marriage right there. It was 1982, and I worked at a small local grocery store called Hometown Foods right here in this plaza. My friend Paul and I were gathering carts right out here, and I had just come back with a group of carts, and there was this guy walking towards me down this way, an older gentleman. I kind of ignored him at first. I saw that he was staggering, and I looked up and I noticed it was my father. His eyes were dark and sunken in his head. He was really skinny and gaunt looking. He looked horrible. I almost didn't recognize him. He looked so bad. And he kind of staggered down here and he walked off this way towards the McDonald's. And that was the last time I ever saw him. And as I saw him, I was horrified. I just ran back inside the door to the grocery store was right here, and I ran back inside. And my friend was like, what are you doing? Why did you run inside? I said, well, you wouldn't understand. He's like, what? Why did you run inside? And I said, well, my dad was out there. And he's like, so? And I said, you don't understand. I never told him until years later why I ran inside that day. But I was horrified. I had seen my dad. I didn't want anybody to know that was my dad. I was very embarrassed. And it's hard when your father's the town drunk. And he's staggering around town bumming money off of people, and I think that's what he was probably doing. And I hadn't seen him for a couple of years up to that point. I hadn't seen him in a long time.
Boy, I got my first guitar a long, long time ago. It was a long time ago. My mom and dad got divorced in 1977, and I was in 7th grade. And my mom took a job with a factory. She worked in a factory where she soldered PC boards together all day long. She bought a house. We bought a small house, a 900 square foot house off the square in Chardon. And it had a nice size yard, about 1/4 of an acre. She got me a dog, and I named the dog Coco. And Coco was a brown Labrador Springer Spaniel mix. And after Mom had worked at this factory for a while, she saved up some money, and I had been bugging her to get me a guitar. She went out and bought me my first guitar. It was a 6-string acoustic guitar. This is it right here. And we'll open this up. This is the original case, cardboard case. It's not strung anymore. And this is my Hondo 2 6-string acoustic guitar. And it's made in Korea.
And this is my first guitar. And I played this guitar to death. And she got it for me for our first Christmas together after Mom and Dad got divorced. And I can't tell you how thrilled I was. I was just beside myself with happiness. She agreed to sign me up for guitar lessons. There was a small guitar music store in town on the square in Chardon called Zamers Music. First things I learned on her were like Jingle Bells and, things like that. But the first song I learned all the way through, I learned to read music. And the first song I learned to read music on was Let It Snow. But I learned everything on this guitar. I learned the first Beatles song I ever learned, and the first song ever that I learned, pop song, was Yesterday. Then I learned the song Help, because Help at the time was my most favorite song. Music has been a source of inspiration. Music has been my counselor. Music has been a sanctuary. Music has been a way of me going down the road of self-discovery and learning about myself. And if it weren't for the guitar and the guitar my mother got, I wouldn't have had any way to really discover a lot of things I discovered about myself and about my parents and about my life. But most important, it's been a way for me to, express myself. And when they got divorced, my immediate thought at the time as an ignorant young man was I thought once Dad's gone, everything's going to get better. I thought that was it. I thought my dad being gone, our lives will get better. Subconsciously, as I look back on it now, I went into kind of a depressive state. I was really confused because my parents are divorced. And as I look back on it, I wonder if I felt bad for my dad in a way I didn't really understand at the time, because once he was gone, I just became very withdrawn. Once they got divorced, I became withdrawn. And I found myself retreating. And I became very reclusive. And 8th grade was probably the last time in school that I actually had friends. I had really close friends until about 10th grade. Between the end of 8th grade and 10th grade, I didn't have any friends. I just would come home and play my guitar, listen to music after school. And then in 10th grade, I started hanging out with some new people. But I became very bitter. I became very negative. I became very cynical. I was mad at the world, as a lot of teenagers are. And I became very, rebellious. I grew my hair long. I didn't start drinking and smoking. I've never smoked. I didn't have my first beer till I was 19 and I was in college. And I didn't drink to rebel. I drank because it was fun. It was fun. It made me feel good. It made me laugh. I used the guitar to kind of, escape. Originally I escaped in the music of the Beatles. That was my original escape. And then I escaped into the music of the guitar, learning to play the guitar. Towards the end of my sophomore year, my mother got sick. I got a call one day. She was in the hospital. And they said she was gravely ill. I better get home quickly or I may never see her again.
And how did that make you feel?
Oh, it was awful. It was horrible. And what's even worse is just a few months later, my father died.
Oh, wow. Well, hey, I'm really sorry, Pete. You know what? We're out of time for today.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I'm really sorry. Yeah,
really?
Yeah, I'm serious. Why don't you go ahead and make an appointment for next Thursday with Rhonda at the front desk?
All right, I'll see you next week.
Where we left off today, next Thursday, okay? Yeah, I'm sorry. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Something so frightening and it don't feel right. Giants are fighting in the middle of the hall. I'm so scared of spilled alcohol.
Spilled Alcohol is a song that I wrote that talks about, it initially talks about how they told me that my dad had a disease, that alcoholism was a disease. I'm 7, 8 years old when I heard this. I'm like, what? A disease? Like cancer? I remember asking one of the counselors, like, oh, yes, it's just like cancers, young man. And your dad's a very sick man. And I found it very confusing as a kid that alcoholism, my dad's issues were a disease. So the opening lines.
They told me you were sick, you had a disease. I found it so hard and easy to believe. When the lights are out, I don't know what to think at all.
When the lights are out, the apartment would go dark and the storms would roll in off the lake and they would start fighting. And he'd beat the hell out of my mom. She'd beat the hell out of him too. And it was like two giants fighting. They're throwing furniture at each other. And she's going after him with knives and, all kinds of horrible stuff. It's just this song is the first song I ever really wrote to help me express myself about the confusion of being a little kid, growing up in an alcoholic family, growing up with two alcoholic parents. When you're raised in this environment, it's understood, or it's told you straight out, you do not talk about this outside the house. This is something you're supposed to keep a secret. Most of the time, you don't want to talk about it. You hope nobody ever knows about it. You don't want the secret or the skeleton to get out of the closet. And I can assure you that it's a hard thing to talk about. And talking about it does help. Talking about it really does help. And it helps you cope with your past. I believe I'm a survivor, and I'm stronger for what I went through as a kid. I had a counselor once that told me that he had patients that he had counseled that had been through half as much as what I had gone through as a kid. And many of these people turned out to be felons, rapists, murderers. They're in the state penitentiary for doing atrocious crimes. And a lot of it stemmed from what they went through as a kid. And I feel very fortunate that I've turned out as good as I have. My dad never harmed me physically in any way, shape, or form. I remember one time I did something stupid and Mom got really mad. She looked at my dad and said, well, I'm not going to spank him, you spank him. Dad took me by the hand, led me into my bedroom. He sat on the edge of my bed, turned me around, gave me a light tap on the butt and said, get out of here. To me, Dad seemed withdrawn, almost like a phantom sitting in the room with the rest of us. He never had much to say about anything that I can remember. Most of what I know about my dad, I learned from my mom. She told me he was a tremendous athlete in high school. He played baseball, football, basketball, and ran track. His popularity in school led the student body to nickname him Hercules. You can't talk about my dad without talking about baseball. Mom said he was a natural when it came to playing the game. He played first base, could bat from either side of the plate, and could throw with both hands. He and I never bonded by going to any Cleveland Indians or Cleveland Browns games together. The only time I bonded with him was when I was 13 and I wanted to try out for baseball as a pitcher. He spent a couple of weekends with me in the backyard showing me how to throw a curveball. I cherish that memory to this day. Anytime I watch a ball game on TV or see a group of guys playing at the local ballpark, I think of my dad. It was the early morning hours of January 13th, 1987, and I was asleep in bed. The 13th was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays and Thursdays, my junior year of college, were my busiest days. I was in class from 8 in the morning to about 4 in the afternoon. That morning while I slept before I got up to go to school, I had a dream. And in this dream, it was like the third person perspective. It was like I was a cameraman looking through the lens of a camera and at myself sitting at a chair. And I was sitting in this chair and it was dark all around me. And from the darkness appeared my father, and he was behind me. So I was sitting in this chair, and he appeared behind me, and he reached out, and he touched me on the shoulder, and he spoke to me. And it was a very brief message. I'm not going to say what he said because it's very personal. And then he faded away and the dream ended. And I didn't think anything of this dream. I had pretty much forgotten about it. My alarm went off. I got up and went to school. Had my classes. Came home that day, got home about 4:30. And as I walked up the steps to my fraternity house, I noticed a note on the front door that said, "Pete, call home." It was just like a piece of yellow notebook paper taped to the door. One of my fraternity brothers had written down the note and it said, "Pete, call home. Your mom wants you to call home." So I thought, that's kind of weird. So I walked, I took the note off the door and I walked inside the house. Outside my bedroom door. This is back in the days before cell phones. And all we had were push button phones. There was a push button phone on the wall outside of my room. And I picked it up and I called home and I said, "Hey, Mom, what's going on? This is Pete." And I don't remember her pausing or hesitating or trying to make it an easy thing to say, or she didn't say, "Are you sitting down?" She didn't say, "Make sure you're sitting down," or "Are you okay right now because I got some bad news for us." She just said, "I'm so sorry to tell you, but your dad's been murdered." And I all remember from that point forward, I heard the words, "Your dad's been murdered." And it was as if someone had punched me as hard as they could in the stomach. And I doubled over crying and I fell to the ground. Like a heap, just in a heap, I fell to the floor with the phone in my hands and I was sobbing like I had never cried before. And I just remember her saying, that a woman that he lived with, his girlfriend had shot him, and then she took her own life. And I don't remember anything other than the phone conversation, just being completely floored, literally floored, like knocked to the ground by this message. And I immediately thought of the dream I had had that night, the previous night, of my dad. And it occurred to me that he had spoken to me in this dream. I didn't think it was a coincidence. I think my father was reaching out to me from the beyond to say goodbye. That dream has always stuck with me. It's always been in the back of my mind that my father, from the afterlife, he reached out to me, and I think he was saying goodbye. I think he was saying he was sorry. In his own way, he was saying he was sorry for what had happened in my childhood with him. I have this feeling he wanted to speak to me before he died, but he didn't get a chance to.
Soon after my father died, I began to ask the universe a lot of questions. In the spring of my senior year in college, I had what most people call a religious experience. I had found Christ. I was born again, and for the first time ever, there was serenity in my life. It was a beautiful thing, but it didn't last very long. After graduating from college, I moved back home and started hanging out with my buddies from high school. We were frequenting local bars, and Jesus pretty much went right out the window. Over the years, I've gone down a variety of different metaphysical and spiritual trails. I've tried meditation. I've read a boatload of self-help books. At the advice of one counselor, I even tried exercising. But none of these things worked for me. The only thing that's helped me cope with my childhood is facing it head-on with my music and my art. I look at it like you're on the beaches of Normandy during the D-Day invasion of World War II, and you've got to get off the beach if you want to live. If you stay on the beach, you're going to get blown to pieces. I just keep forging ahead into the withering machine gun fire with my guitars, my paintbrushes, and easels. After wrestling with the ghosts and the skeletons from my past, I've come to an acceptance and have found a forgiveness towards both of my parents. My art has helped me find peace in my life today.